This is also a time of change for my family.
The summit was supposed to settle a private royal dispute before it could become a public crisis. Instead, one unfamiliar face changed everything. Catherine noticed him first, a suited solicitor seated inside Kensington Palace, despite his name appearing nowhere on the approved attendance list. Charles looked toward the doorway, then back at the stranger. Within moments, the king stopped the royal summit completely, leaving William silent, and every person in the room wondering who had brought the lawyer inside. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine kept her voice low, but unease spread through her. She had entered Kensington Palace, expecting a restricted family summit, where Charles, William, household figures and approved advisors would settle a dispute over private royal property and future authority. A royal household, in simple terms, is the staff and advisors supporting a senior royal. That made the stranger's presence dangerous. Catherine checked the attendance list, then looked back at Adrian Mercer, seated beside a table with a leather case open and handwritten notes beneath his hand. William saw the change in her face before anyone else. She leaned toward Charles and quietly gave him the solicitor's name. The monarch looked at Mercer, placed both hands flat against the table, and cut across an advisor mid-sentence. This meeting goes no further. William stayed silent. Catherine did not move. Everyone suddenly understood this was not a seating mistake. Someone had entered a private discussion involving property, influence, and future authority, without the king's direct approval. Mercer reacted with unnerving calm. He closed his notebook, gathered 2 loose pages, and said he believed his attendance had been properly authorized. Charles asked by whom. The solicitor hesitated, said only that he had acted on instructions. He would not name the person. Catherine felt exposed. If Mercer had been placed there deliberately, someone wanted him listening while the family believed they were speaking privately. A palace aide checked the security-approved guest sheet. Mercer's name was absent. No amendment carried the king's approval, and no official addition had passed through. Charles stared at the page, then at the lawyer, while William realized the breach had come from somewhere inside the royal circle. Mercer finally rose to leave. As he closed the leather case, Catherine caught 3 handwritten words near the top of one page. William saw them too, and his expression tightened. They belonged to an old private dispute they had hoped was finished. The stranger was being removed, but the danger had never been only the man in the chair. It was the person who had put him there. Once the doors closed behind the solicitor, the summit stopped being about security. It became personal. Charles wanted to know who had breached his authority. William wanted to know whether his family had been watched. Catherine wanted to understand why the stranger possessed notes connected to a dispute she believed had been buried. And somewhere inside the palace, another person already knew the answer, because Mercer had not walked into Kensington by accident. Charles did not waste time pretending the breach was minor. The summit had been restricted because it involved private royal property, future household authority, and decisions that could affect how power moved between his reign and William's future role. A royal household is simply the team of advisors and staff serving a senior member of the family, and control over who advises those households can carry enormous influence. The king understood that an unauthorized legal observer inside such a meeting was not just embarrassing, it challenged his command directly. William felt the threat differently. The prince was less concerned about palace procedure than about Catherine. He had watched Mercer closely after she raised the alarm, and now her discomfort troubled him more than the cancelled summit itself. The disputed material touched their home, their advisors, and how much independence their household would have as responsibilities increased. If someone was quietly collecting statements for later legal use, then the couple had entered the room believing they were speaking freely when someone else was treating every sentence as evidence. Catherine followed William into an adjoining room and waited until he closed the door. No aides remained with them. She told him Mercer had not behaved like a man simply recording minutes. He had watched faces. He had looked up whenever her name was mentioned. Then she described the 3 handwritten words she had glimpsed inside his leather case. William stayed silent for several seconds before asking whether she was completely certain. Her answer came without hesitation. "I would not have stopped the king if I wasn't." Charles, meanwhile, pressed the official responsible for summit access. The man searched through the paperwork and finally produced a secondary authorization slip. One handwritten instruction permitted a legal observer to attend. In plain language, that meant someone had tried to give a lawyer permission to sit inside the meeting without listing him among the normal invited advisors. The problem sat at the bottom of the page. The signature was not Charles's. The discovery deepened the danger. Mercer's notes referred to an old disagreement involving private access, residence rights, and whether certain royal households could appoint advisors independently of Buckingham Palace. The king now saw another possibility. Mercer had not been present merely to listen. His notes may have been intended for a future legal challenge. Charles ordered the authorization traced backward immediately. Staff followed the paperwork until one name surfaced. It was not Mercer. It belonged to a long-serving intermediary who had been present during another deeply uncomfortable royal discussion months earlier. That name changed everything. To understand why a solicitor had been smuggled into the summit, Charles would have to return to the confrontation everyone had tried to bury. The moment when this crisis truly began. The solicitor's appearance shocked Kensington Palace. But the conflict behind it had begun months earlier. There had been warnings, private disagreements, and carefully controlled conversations. Then came one meeting that changed the temperature completely. No cameras captured it. No public statement followed. Yet everyone who sat inside that room understood that something had fractured, and the argument born there would eventually place an unauthorized lawyer only feet away from Catherine. William had tried to keep the tension contained. Questions were growing over where the king's household ended and where the Prince and Princess of Wales's independent authority began. A royal household is the network of staff and advisors supporting a senior member of the family, and control over those advisors could shape who heard sensitive discussions and who influenced major decisions. Catherine had become especially protective after private conversations appeared to travel beyond the small group originally present. The prince shared her concern, but he wanted quiet boundaries, not a family rupture. 3 months before the Kensington summit, that restraint was tested inside the king's drawing room at Windsor. A senior intermediary placed a proposed memorandum in front of William and asked him to approve it. A memorandum is simply a written document setting out an agreement or proposed course of action. This one would allow an outside legal advisor access to certain future negotiations involving his household. William read the crucial passage twice, pushed the paper back across the table, and refused to sign. Catherine entered during the second half of that meeting and immediately sensed the tension. When she learned what the proposal contained, she asked why an external solicitor needed advance access to conversations involving her own household. The intermediary called it a protective measure. She did not accept the answer. Later, speaking privately with William, she said the proposal felt less like protection and more like preparation for a dispute nobody was willing to admit had already begun. He agreed, but still hoped refusal would end the matter. Charles reacted differently when the document reached him. The king was angered by one detail above all others. The memorandum had been introduced as though it carried his authority, even though he had never explicitly approved it. He questioned William, then Catherine, and quickly understood neither had created the confrontation. Someone else had borrowed the weight of the monarch's name to pressure them toward an arrangement they had already resisted. The real danger sat in a handwritten notation near the bottom of the rejected document. Situational access where necessary. Charles immediately recognized the phrase. Nearly identical wording appeared on the secondary authorization that later admitted Mercer into Kensington Palace. That connection destroyed any remaining belief that the summit breach had been improvised. Someone had preserved the rejected Windsor proposal, revived its language, and acted as though authority denied months earlier still existed. Charles ordered the paperwork traced. One intermediary appeared in both chains. The past had supplied the motive. Now the palace wanted a name, and the next confrontation would force one person to explain why the king's authority had been used without his permission. By the time the intermediary entered the room, Charles had already placed the authorization slip beside the rejected Windsor memorandum. There would be no broad discussion, and no graceful escape. Catherine was present. William stood beside her. The king wanted a single answer. Who had decided that Adrian Mercer should hear a private royal summit? What followed was not a debate over protocol. It was a face-to-face reckoning over trust. Sir Malcolm Vane had spent years moving quietly between royal households, senior officials, and legal advisors. His value came from discretion, which made his presence in the chain especially serious. An authorization slip is simply written permission allowing someone access to a restricted meeting, and the one before Charles carried language almost identical to the rejected Windsor proposal. The king pushed both documents across the table. He did not raise his voice. He simply asked whether Malcolm had authorized Mercer. Malcolm looked at the papers, then at Catherine. He admitted he had allowed the solicitor inside, but insisted the decision had been made to protect everyone in the room. Catherine answered before Charles could speak. Protect us from whom? The question landed harder than anger. Malcolm shifted in his chair and avoided her eyes. William watched him closely, already realizing that the solicitor had not been hidden by accident. Someone had expected resistance. William's restraint broke when Malcolm admitted the prince and Catherine had deliberately not been told. He feared they would object and stop Mercer from attending. The future king leaned forward and told him that was exactly the point. Advice becomes deception when the people being observed are denied the chance to consent. Catherine said nothing, but Malcolm could see the damage clearly now. Her private concern had been justified from the beginning. Malcolm finally insisted he had not acted alone. A private request had reached him days before the summit from someone who feared the meeting could produce a binding family decision before legal objections were prepared. A binding decision, in simple terms, is an agreement intended to carry real authority rather than remain informal discussion. Mercer had therefore been instructed to record remarks about residence arrangements, independent household authority, and Catherine's objections so another legal team could review them later. Charles stared at Malcolm. The king asked who had requested that protection. Silence followed. Malcolm reached into his folder instead of answering. He removed a sealed note and placed it carefully in front of Charles. The monarch looked down at the handwriting and froze. He knew it immediately. William saw his father's expression change. Catherine saw it too. The confrontation had exposed the method, but the sealed note would expose the power behind it, and force Charles to decide whether blood, loyalty, or royal authority mattered most. The most dangerous part of the crisis was no longer the unauthorized solicitor. It was the assumption behind his presence, that somebody believed royal authority could be borrowed, stretched, or quietly bypassed. Charles now faced a harder problem than removing one man from Kensington. He had to decide who controlled the process itself. And as the sealed note was opened, William realized the summit had become a test of whether the king could still command his own household. Charles read the note alone at the end of the table. His face tightened before he folded the page once and placed it beside an untouched glass. A royal household is the staff and advisors working directly for a senior member of the family, and the king normally controls who enters meetings called under his authority. Yet William and Catherine also had their own household, their own advisors, and their own right to protect private discussions. That overlap created the opening someone had exploited. William watched his father struggle between anger and disappointment. Catherine lowered her eyes when Charles finally explained what the note contained. The request had come from someone inside the wider royal circle who feared losing future access and wanted legal protection before the summit could impose new restrictions. The king felt betrayed for one simple reason. His authority had been used to make the intervention look legitimate when he had never approved it. Catherine felt the pressure turn toward her. Mercer's instructions had focused heavily on her objections, making it seem as though her concerns were the threat everyone else needed protection from. William pulled her aside and told her she had done nothing wrong by noticing the solicitor. She looked at him and answered quietly that this was not what troubled her most. Someone had expected her not to notice. Someone had counted on her staying silent. Charles moved quickly. He ordered every page from Mercer's notes secured before anything could leave royal custody. A numbered document set means each page is marked in sequence, so missing material can be identified immediately. Staff counted once, then again. One page was gone. The silence changed. Security records were checked against the solicitor's movements before the summit began. The logs showed Mercer handing a sealed envelope to another person shortly before entering the meeting room. That envelope then moved through a separate corridor, while Charles, William, and Catherine were still inside, believing the breach had been contained. The king understood the consequence immediately. Stopping the summit had prevented more private remarks from being gathered, but it had not stopped everything. Somewhere beyond that room, one page containing royal conversations had already escaped his control. Charles had regained command of Kensington Palace. The missing page proved command had come too late, and the fallout was about to hit Catherine first. The summit ended without agreement, but Catherine carried something heavier away from Kensington, the knowledge that her private words had been deliberately singled out. She had noticed the solicitor. She had stopped the breach from continuing. Yet now one missing page threatened to turn her vigilance into the center of the controversy. As staff began canceling meetings and restricting access, the princess faced the disturbing possibility that doing the right thing had made her the easiest person to target. Charles moved first. He ordered an immediate review of summit access, suspended Malcolm from sensitive duties, and blocked Mercer from receiving any further palace material while the missing page was traced. A suspension from sensitive duties simply means an official is temporarily removed from work involving confidential royal matters. William tightened his own household rules at the same time. No outside legal representative would enter a private meeting involving Catherine again without direct written approval from their office. Catherine returned to her private sitting room and found the cancelled summit agenda waiting inside a folder. She read the line where her household had been due to speak, then closed the file slowly. William watched her expression change. "They were waiting for me to say something they could use," she said quietly. The prince's anger rose immediately. He told her the summit had collapsed because someone violated trust, not because she exposed the violation. But she feared the family might remember the disruption more clearly than the reason she had spoken. Charles refused to send an aide. He called Catherine himself. The king thanked her for raising the alarm and admitted something that clearly cost him pride. The breach had happened inside a meeting he had personally promised would remain private. Catherine heard the embarrassment in his voice. She told him she did not want blame shifted from one person to another. She wanted to know whether her words had already been carried beyond the room. The answer came hours later. Investigators examined the sheet that had been beneath the missing page and recovered faint impressions from the writing pressure above it. The surviving phrases referred to future household independence and Catherine's objections to outside influence. William felt his stomach tighten when he read the preliminary account. Whoever took that page had chosen material connected directly to his wife. Then the trail narrowed again. The envelope had never left royal grounds through ordinary mail. Security records showed it had been handed to someone still inside the wider palace network. Charles now knew who had planned the breach. William knew what had been taken. Catherine understood why she had been watched. Only one question remained. Could she face the person whose fear had set all of this in motion? The paperwork had exposed the scheme, but only one conversation could end it, and Catherine was about to enter that room without lawyers, officials, or palace procedure standing between them. There were no secretaries taking notes when Catherine entered the room. No lawyers sat near the walls. No officials waited to interrupt. For the first time since the summit collapsed, the conflict was reduced to two people and the fear that had driven everything. Catherine did not come demanding punishment. She wanted an answer. Why had someone believed an unseen solicitor was necessary? And why had her private words been considered dangerous enough to preserve? Charles had arranged the meeting because discipline alone could not repair what had been broken. The king could suspend officials, tighten access, and control future meetings, but he knew none of that would restore trust between two members of the family. William offered to go in with Catherine. She refused gently. She wanted no hierarchy, no advisors, and no intermediaries. If the truth was finally going to come out, nobody would be able to hide behind palace procedure. Catherine sat opposite the royal figure whose private request had started the chain leading to Malcolm and Mercer. She did not circle the issue. Were you afraid of what the summit would decide, or were you afraid of what I would say? The answer came almost immediately. The fear had been losing future access and influence. That admission changed the conversation. What had looked like legal strategy was suddenly revealed as something far more human. Panic. Catherine listened, but she did not soften the damage. She explained that the hidden solicitor had changed more than one meeting. It had turned family conversation into possible evidence. Trust could not survive if every private sentence carried the fear that someone unseen was preserving it for later use. The other royal admitted that William and Catherine seemed powerful enough to close doors permanently, and legal preparation had felt safer than simply asking what they intended. Then came the revelation that stripped the crisis of its darkest assumption. The missing page contained no threat. According to the recovered written account, Catherine had only argued that future royal decisions should be transparent, and that family access should never depend on private pressure. In other words, the entire scheme had been built around fear of something she had never planned to do. Catherine made her decision quietly. She would not demand public humiliation. She would not seek revenge. But one boundary was absolute. No private legal intervention involving her household would ever happen again without her knowledge. Charles accepted that condition and prepared a formal internal ruling. William stood behind his wife's choice, relieved that she had chosen limits over punishment. But the family's private resolution came too late to stop the outside world. Inside Kensington, the truth had finally been spoken. Outside its gates, the public was about to hear only one explosive fact. The king had stopped a royal summit because Catherine spotted a solicitor who should never have been there. Private royal crises rarely remain private once a meeting suddenly collapses. By morning, the story had escaped the palace walls. The public did not know every document, every whispered admission, or every private apology. They knew something simpler and far more dramatic. Catherine had noticed an unknown solicitor inside Kensington. Charles had stopped the summit, and palace officials had begun asking how an unauthorized legal observer entered one of the monarchy's most sensitive family meetings. Charles approved only the briefest public response. The palace confirmed that a scheduled private meeting had ended early because of an internal access concern, but it did not name Mercer or explain the dispute behind his presence. An internal access concern simply means someone entered or remained inside a restricted royal setting without the proper level of approval. That careful wording protected the family from exposing private legal arguments, but it also created a vacuum that commentators rushed to fill. Outside Kensington Palace, the crisis suddenly became public theater. Television crews gathered near the gates, while a small crowd formed behind them, waiting for movement or explanation. At a nearby kiosk, one front page dominated the display. Catherine spots palace intruder. King halts summit. The headline reduced days of fear, legal maneuvering, and private betrayal to one explosive moment. For the public, that single sentence became the story. Catherine watched a morning broadcast for less than a minute before switching it off. William saw the discomfort immediately. He told her she was being portrayed as the reason the summit collapsed, rather than the person who discovered why it had to stop. The princess answered that headlines rarely carried the difference. What troubled her was not criticism. It was watching a deeply personal breach become entertainment before the family had even absorbed what happened. Charles felt the same frustration, but made one point absolute. No palace briefing would describe Catherine's intervention as disruptive. The king believed her decision to speak had contained the damage, and he would not allow officials to rewrite that fact simply because the public narrative had become uncomfortable. Questions still multiplied. Why would a solicitor need to enter a royal family summit without the knowledge of the people being observed? The palace refused to explain the underlying disagreement, denying commentators the details needed to turn the affair into a wider legal battle. Charles then authorized an internal notice, confirming that unauthorized legal attendance had occurred and that tighter access rules were now in force. Without naming Catherine as a victim, the wording effectively vindicated her. The world had chosen its headline. The king still had to choose his verdict. He had the missing page, the admissions, and the truth. What came next would decide whether this remained a family wound or became the moment the monarchy finally redrew its boundaries. The crisis ended not with a dramatic expulsion or another furious confrontation, but with Charles making the one decision the family could no longer avoid. The unauthorized solicitor had exposed a deeper weakness. Too many people believed influence could substitute for permission, and fear could justify secrecy. Catherine had shattered that assumption simply by noticing the wrong man in the wrong room. Now the king had to decide what trust inside the monarchy would mean from that day forward. Charles issued a final internal ruling. No outside legal representative would ever again attend a private royal family meeting under his authority, without advance written approval from every household directly affected. An internal ruling is simply a formal decision applied within palace operations rather than through public law. Malcolm was permanently removed from coordinating sensitive family summits, while Mercer's unauthorized notes were returned, sealed, and blocked from future use. The recovered missing page was placed with the official review record instead of being turned into evidence against anyone. Charles then met William and Catherine privately at Kensington. The king placed the written decision on the table and pushed it toward them. He looked directly at Catherine and told her the summit had stopped because she noticed something others had failed to question. She read the first page carefully, then set it beside William. The moment carried no triumph. For her, this had never been about winning. It was about making sure a family conversation could still remain a family conversation. Catherine told Charles exactly that. Secrecy disguised as protection had almost destroyed the trust everyone claimed they were trying to preserve. The monarch agreed. William accepted the new boundaries too, but the prince made one thing clear. He wanted no revenge against the person whose fear had started the chain leading to Mercer. Distance was necessary. Transparency was essential. Humiliation was not. Charles then confirmed the final truth. The missing page contained no threat, no hidden plan, and no attempt by Catherine to force anyone from the family. It recorded her arguing for transparent future decisions and an end to private pressure. The entire operation had been built around fear of what others imagined she might eventually do. That realization changed everything. The original summit was never reconvened. Instead, each disputed issue was handled through separate, openly authorized conversations, where everyone knew who was present and why. Catherine emerged with stronger trust from Charles and deeper unity with William. The king emerged with a painful lesson about how easily authority could be borrowed when boundaries were weak. Charles stopped one summit, but in doing so he ended something far more dangerous: the belief that royal trust could be manipulated behind closed doors. Catherine did not fracture the monarchy. She forced it to protect the one thing no crown can command once it is lost: trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.